Andrew Carter stood across the street from Morning Bloom Bakery, staring at the storefront he had once known so intimately. The early morning sun painted golden highlights across the frosted windows, giving the place a warm glow that belied the storm brewing inside. At 54, Andrew was far removed from his days of flour-dusted aprons and 4 a.m. baking shifts. In recent years, he had stepped back from day-to-day operations, trusting the managers he had handpicked to carry forward the legacy his grandmother had built. But 3 consecutive quarters of shrinking profits and a growing number of customer complaints had awakened a deep unease in him. The numbers didn't make sense. So today, he wasn't the successful business owner everyone knew. Today, he was just another customer in faded jeans, a nondescript hoodie, and a ball cap pulled low over salt and pepper hair. With glasses slightly too large for his face and a forced slouch in his posture, he crossed the street with a purpose only he understood. As he stepped through the front door, the soft chime of the bell overhead triggered a rush of nostalgia and a gut check of disappointment. The air should have been filled with the scent of fresh-baked bread and cinnamon glaze, but instead there was a faint, stale undertone. The rich aroma that had once made passers-by stop in their tracks seemed diluted like a shadow of the past. He made his way to the counter, where Jake, a young employee, offered a robotic, "Welcome to Morning Bloom. What can I get for you?" Andrew forced a raspy voice, deliberately avoiding eye contact. "Just a chocolate-glazed donut and a black coffee." The cashier nodded and rang him up. "That'll be $5.25. Andrew blinked. $5.25 for one donut and a basic cup of coffee. He paid silently and carried the small tray to a table in the corner, one that gave him a wide view of the entire store. He picked up the donut and took a bite. It looked the same on the outside, perfectly round, the glaze shiny and smooth. But the taste, it was off. The texture was dense, bordering on rubbery, and the chocolate glaze had a synthetic aftertaste that lingered unpleasantly. As he sat chewing slowly, trying not to grimace, 2 familiar faces appeared behind the counter. Brian Matthews and Eric Russo, the senior managers Andrew had personally promoted 18 months ago. Dressed in company polos and whispering close, they didn't notice Andrew sitting quietly in the corner. He leaned slightly forward, straining to catch their words. "Another dead morning," Brian muttered, tapping the register. "At this rate, the old man will be begging us to buy him out by New Year's." Andrew's heart sank, his jaw tightening as he froze mid-chew. Did he hear that right? Eric chuckled in response, completely unaware of who was within earshot. "Carter's too soft for this business, still clinging to Grandma's recipes like they're some sacred text. The guy actually thinks customers care about quality and tradition." Andrew's blood ran cold. His grip on the paper coffee cup tightened slightly. He could barely believe what he was hearing. His trusted managers openly mocking him, reducing decades of family legacy to sentimental garbage. Brian continued, lowering his voice, but not enough to avoid being heard. "You see those numbers I showed him last week? Dude looked like he might cry. Beautiful work." Eric laughed. "He has no clue what's going on. We've got our buyer lined up. Once he's desperate enough, we swoop in and pick up the place for a steal." Andrew's hands trembled slightly under the table, but he forced himself to remain composed. Every instinct in him screamed to stand up, tear off the disguise, and confront them. But he knew better. Years of legal training had taught him that emotion didn't win cases. Evidence did. He lowered his gaze and pretended to sip the coffee, which was bitter and over-roasted. His mind was already racing, replaying every moment of the conversation. These men he had trusted, were plotting a hostile takeover of his life's work, not just with words, but with real financial manipulation. And worse, they were succeeding. Andrew's silence wasn't a weakness. It was strategy. He had built Morning Bloom with his bare hands and his grandmother's handwritten recipe book. If Brian and Eric thought they could rob him of that legacy without consequences, they had underestimated the man behind the disguise. He wouldn't just stop them, he would expose them. By the time Brian and Eric retreated into the office, laughing and oblivious, Andrew had already made his decision. He took another bite of the tasteless doughnut and washed it down with the harsh coffee. It was symbolic now, a reminder of what had been lost and what had to be reclaimed. The real flavor of Morning Bloom wasn't in the ingredients anymore. It was in the honesty, the hard work, and the community it once stood for. He stood slowly, leaving the tray on the table, and walked out without a word. The cold wind outside stung his face, but it also cleared his thoughts. He had come seeking answers. Instead, he found a betrayal so deep it demanded action. And Andrew Carter was ready. Back at his apartment, Andrew Carter paced across the living room, the echo of Brian and Eric's voices still ringing in his ears. Their laughter, their arrogance, their utter disregard for everything Morning Bloom stood for, it gnawed at him like a disease. He dropped his disguise by the door, removing the cap and glasses that had shielded his identity, and slumped into the leather chair in his study. The coffee he brought back sat untouched on the table beside him, growing cold by the minute. He reached for his laptop and opened the most recent financial reports, spreadsheets filled with numbers that had been bothering him for months. Now, with fresh context, everything began to shift into focus. The drops in revenue weren't just due to inflation or market trends. They were orchestrated, crafted, deliberate. As he reviewed the records, his suspicions solidified into a disturbing picture. Markups on menu items were steep, particularly on bestsellers like the chocolate-glazed doughnuts and signature pastries. Yet ingredient expenses had plummeted. The only logical explanation, they were cutting quality while raising prices. His gut twisted. It wasn't just incompetence, it was sabotage, and he hadn't even seen the worst of it yet. Late that night, Andrew stumbled upon something buried in an email thread he'd been copied on months ago. A vague mention of Midline Partners LLC stood out. The name hadn't meant anything at the time, but now it sent a jolt of dread down his spine. He dug deeper and found references to a potential buyer and a projected sale timeline. The phrasing was subtle, but the intent was clear. Brian and Eric were planning to buy Morning Bloom themselves using a shell company. The rebrand plan was already underway. Hidden in project folders and digital notes labeled miscellaneous, Andrew found early-stage mock-ups for Metro Bites, a slick, modern concept that bore no resemblance to the warm, inviting charm of Morning Bloom. Gone were the cozy fonts, the nostalgic color palette, and the emphasis on community. In their place, sterile grey logos, urban minimalist designs, and menu concepts that read like mass-produced food chains. There were no mentions of his grandmother's recipes, no seasonal specials named after local teachers or firefighters, and no community bulletin board. Metro Bites was soulless by design. It was a betrayal not just of the business, but of everything Morning Bloom had stood for. Andrew leaned back in his chair, breath shallow, eyes burning with exhaustion and disbelief. Brian and Eric had played him perfectly, presenting false reports, controlling customer complaints, isolating him from staff, and spinning narratives that made it seem like they were protecting the business while slowly bleeding it dry. It wasn't just greed that hurt. It was the cold, calculated nature of their actions. These were men he had trusted, mentored, believed in, and they had reduced Morning Bloom to a line item in their portfolio strategy. But instead of anger clouding his mind, clarity settled in. This wouldn't be fixed with confrontation. They would lie, spin, and cover their tracks. What he needed wasn't a confrontation. He needed evidence. The next morning, Andrew returned to the bakery, once again disguised. He wasn't there to order this time. He was there to watch, to listen. He positioned himself at a table near the hallway that led to the back offices, his ears tuned for anything revealing. He saw Brian step outside to take a call. Minutes later, Eric joined him, casually discussing next steps in hushed tones. They spoke of financials, timing, and getting the books in shape before presenting the offer to the seller, Andrew himself. "He won't know what hit him," Eric said with a smirk, flicking ash from his cigarette. "He thinks he's in control. That old fool has no idea he's been handing us the keys for months." Andrew's heart pounded, but his face remained calm. Each word was a nail in their own coffin. That night, back in his office, Andrew began building a war room. He pulled out old legal templates from his corporate attorney days, creating a case file that he would update day by day. He listed names of employees, suppliers, and customers who might serve as witnesses. He mapped out the timelines of the price hikes and supplier changes. He created a spreadsheet that tracked every financial anomaly he could trace. He made a list of the bakery's original recipes, comparing them to current inventory levels, calculating the drop in quality ingredient orders. Most importantly, he outlined what he still needed: a confession, something undeniable, something that would expose their plot beyond question. This wasn't just about saving a business, this was about preserving a legacy. The following Tuesday morning, Andrew returned to Morning Bloom Bakery under the same disguise, hood pulled forward, glasses low, his pace unhurried. The bell above the door gave its usual chime, but the sound no longer brought the warmth it once had. He took his place at the same corner table, a silent witness to the unfolding decay of a business he had once nurtured with heart and soul. The aroma of baked goods filled the air, but something about it felt off, not in scent, but in spirit. The energy that once buzzed through the bakery, born from cheerful greetings and genuine smiles, had been replaced by mechanical exchanges and forced politeness. Even the music seemed lower, flatter. Morning Bloom, once alive with community, had grown eerily hollow. He didn't have to wait long to see what he'd feared most. Mrs. Peterson shuffled through the door, a small woman with white curls tucked under a red knit hat and a loyalty card dangling from her keychain. She had been coming to Morning Bloom for over 2 decades, always ordering the same thing: a blueberry muffin and a small chamomile tea. Andrew remembered watching her celebrate her 70th birthday in the bakery 5 years ago, surrounded by friends and a cake specially made by his team. She approached the counter with a familiar warmth in her smile, clearly expecting the comfort of routine. Eric stood behind the register, eyes scanning his phone until he noticed her. "Morning," he said flatly. "What can I get you?" Mrs. Peterson didn't seem to notice his indifference. "Just the usual, dear," she said with a soft smile. "Blueberry muffin and chamomile tea." "That'll be $7.50, Eric said, not even glancing up. Andrew's head snapped slightly in disbelief. He knew for a fact that her order had never been more than $5. Mrs. Peterson paused, visibly confused. "Oh, but it's usually—" Eric cut her off, his tone clipped. Prices went up. New management policy. She hesitated, then slowly pulled out a small coin purse, fumbling with quarters and dimes. Her hands trembled slightly as she counted the change, embarrassment settling into her posture. Andrew clenched his fists under the table. He had watched this woman support the bakery through every season, even donating during the pandemic to help keep staff employed. And now she was being treated like an inconvenience, like a problem to be managed. Eric rang up the order and placed the muffin and tea on the counter without a word. Mrs. Peterson gave a quiet, "Thank you," then turned toward a corner booth where she had always sat, her steps slower than usual. Andrew watched her settle into the seat, shoulders slightly slumped, a once bright presence now dimmed. It wasn't just the overcharging. It was the loss of human connection, the callous way Eric had handled a woman who had shown unwavering loyalty for years. Around the room, he noticed similar signs. A father and daughter pair left with their order looking dissatisfied. A couple seated by the window whispered and pointed at their lukewarm lattes. There was no laughter, no "thank you for coming," no sense of welcome. The soul of the bakery was being squeezed out, and no one seemed to care. Then Andrew saw Emily. She emerged from the kitchen briefly, wiping her hands on her apron. Her hair was tied back in a neat bun, though strands had begun to fall around her tired face. Emily had been with Morning Bloom for almost 15 years. She had started as a weekend baker during culinary school and worked her way up to head baker, beloved by the staff and customers alike. She had always carried a quiet dignity, never seeking praise but earning respect through consistency, creativity, and kindness. Today, however, she looked like a shadow of herself. Her eyes scanned the front counter and landed briefly on Eric, her mouth tightening before she looked away. She saw Mrs. Peterson sitting alone, her expression clearly recognizing the hurt. But Emily said nothing. She turned back into the kitchen without a word. Andrew's heart ached at the sight. He knew Emily's silence wasn't apathy. It was fear. Fear of speaking up in an environment that no longer welcomed her voice. Brian and Eric had dismantled the bakery's emotional infrastructure just as thoroughly as they had gutted the recipes. The employees who had once felt like family now moved like ghosts, silenced and uncertain. Andrew jotted quick notes in a small leather-bound notebook tucked in his coat pocket, every detail a piece of a much larger picture. He could feel the weight of what he was seeing, not just financial mismanagement, but emotional erosion, the kind that eats away at a brand's core until nothing of substance remains. As he stood to leave, Andrew paused near the counter. He looked over at Mrs. Peterson, who gave a small, polite nod when their eyes met. She didn't recognize him, of course, but her face held the same gentle kindness he remembered from his early days at the bakery, back when she used to bring in Christmas cards for the staff. He gave her a soft smile in return, then turned and walked out, the door chiming faintly behind him. Outside, the wind felt colder than it had that morning, the sky dimmer. But Andrew's resolve had never been clearer. What had happened to Mrs. Peterson and to Emily was unacceptable, and he would make sure they never had to feel invisible in their own bakery again. Andrew Carter arrived at Morning Bloom Bakery just before dawn, slipping in through the back entrance using a master key that had gathered more dust than fingerprints in recent years. The kitchen was still dark, save for the soft hum of refrigeration units and the faint tick of a wall clock. In the stillness, the space felt almost sacred, like a church awaiting its congregation. Andrew stood for a moment, letting the silence wrap around him, remembering when this kitchen had once been filled with laughter, clanging trays, and the sound of dough being rolled out on marble countertops. But this morning wasn't about nostalgia. It was about facts. He flipped on a single overhead light and moved deliberately toward the inventory shelves, clipboard in hand. What he found over the next hour sent a chill through his bones. He began with the Belgian chocolate, Morning Bloom's hallmark ingredient, imported directly and used in their most beloved pastries. The inventory system claimed 20 pounds had been used in the last week, but Andrew's count showed less than 5 pounds remaining. There were no empty boxes, no signs of bulk usage, and definitely no sales volume to support that kind of depletion. He moved on to the butter, carefully opening crates labeled premium cream butter, only to discover unfamiliar packaging and a greasy, off-smelling substitute. The same was true for the vanilla extract, now in suspiciously generic bottles, and the organic eggs, fewer in quantity and clearly not from their long-time local supplier. The deeper Andrew looked, the more obvious it became. What used to be premium, honest ingredients had been replaced with cheaper, low-quality alternatives, and the paper trail was being masked behind falsified inventory logs. The next stop was a short drive away. Lauren Simmons had been Morning Bloom's accountant for over a decade, working quietly out of a small office above a bookstore downtown. She greeted Andrew with surprise and a concerned smile as he stepped inside just after 7 a.m., still in his hoodie and cap. "Andrew, everything okay?" she asked, motioning him to sit. He didn't waste time. "I need to look at the supplier records," he said, "specifically ingredient purchases over the last 9 months. Lauren, always meticulous and discreet, raised an eyebrow but turned to her desktop computer without further questions. As the records loaded, Andrew leaned in, watching line items scroll past. Flour, sugar, butter, chocolate, vanilla. Then he saw them, unfamiliar vendor names like Global Bake Co. and Urban Taste Distributors, listed as new suppliers for core ingredients. "Who approved these changes?" he asked sharply. Lauren frowned. "Every purchase order was authorized by either Brian or Eric. They said you wanted to shift to more cost-effective options." Andrew felt a wave of nausea rise. He knew the names of every trusted vendor Morning Bloom had worked with for years: local farms, artisanal chocolate makers, family-owned mills. These new companies were strangers, chosen not for quality, but for price. He clicked through invoices and found that many of the substitutes were priced significantly lower than their premium predecessors. Yet the retail prices in-store had gone up by as much as 40%. "Did they ask for these price increases to be run by you?" Lauren asked. Andrew shook his head. "No. I was told we were adjusting for rising supply costs." Lauren sighed. "They said the same to me. But the math doesn't add up. They're saving money on every batch, yet charging customers more." It was a double betrayal. Customers were being overcharged while the quality plummeted, and all under his name. Back at his home office, Andrew opened the files he'd gathered over the last few days, laying them out like pieces of a puzzle. He compared the ingredient costs from before Brian and Eric's promotion with the current numbers. The contrast was glaring. Not only were they skimming on quality, but they were manipulating the supply chain itself. Purchase orders were structured to appear legitimate, but invoice discrepancies showed missing quantities, like 20 pounds of Belgian chocolate vanishing without a trace. He checked sales records for products made with those ingredients, and none of it lined up. Either the chocolate was never used, or it was being sold elsewhere, possibly siphoned off to a side venture. Every line item became a lead, every inconsistency a red flag, and the more he dug, the clearer it became. Brian and Eric weren't just dishonest, they were orchestrating a full-blown fraud. Andrew sat back in his chair, staring at the data, the rage beneath his calm exterior building like steam in a kettle. This wasn't just about money. This was about trust, broken in the most intimate way. The brand he had built with honesty and community had been reduced to a profit machine by two men who had no regard for its soul. They were gutting his bakery from the inside out, poisoning its reputation while pocketing the difference. Worst of all, they were using his name to do it, telling staff, accountants, even vendors that the changes had come from him. He thought of loyal customers like Mrs. Peterson, who had unknowingly paid more for less. Of Emily, who still baked each day believing she was following his orders. And of the customers who had walked away, disappointed and disillusioned, believing Morning Bloom had simply lost its way. But Andrew hadn't lost his way. He'd been blindsided. And now, with the truth taking shape in painful clarity, he was preparing for battle. He scanned and organized every invoice, exported spreadsheets into secure folders, and backed up data on multiple drives. The evidence was mounting, and it was damning. He picked up the phone and called Lauren. "Thank you for helping me this morning. I may need you to testify eventually." There was a pause on the other end. "I figured as much," she said softly. "Whatever you need, I'm in." Andrew nodded, the first sliver of resolve hardening into steel. The fraud ran deep, but so did his commitment to justice. He had spent his life building Morning Bloom on values he could be proud of, and now he was ready to defend them, no matter the cost. The next phase of Andrew Carter's investigation began with a quiet click. Sitting in his home office late into the evening, the warm glow of his desk lamp illuminating rows of spreadsheets and open folders, he logged into Morning Bloom's internal feedback system, a digital space he had personally commissioned years ago to make sure customer concerns never fell through the cracks. Designed to encourage honest, direct feedback, the platform had once served as a vital bridge between the bakery and the community it served. Now, as he sifted through over a year's worth of entries, he felt something far colder settle in his chest. Betrayal had a paper trail. Comments like, "Muffins tasted stale," "prices too high," and "not what it used to be," appeared again and again. But next to nearly every complaint was the same tag. Resolved? Except there were no responses, no refunds, no notes, just silence pretending to be action. Andrew clicked through the logs one by one, the pattern repeating itself like a sinister rhythm. Dozens of customers had expressed concern about product quality, pricing, service attitude, and even the disappearance of long-time menu items. And yet, not a single one had made it to his desk. He remembered telling Brian and Eric that all complaints should be flagged and escalated if they involved pricing or quality. His words spoken with trust. Apparently, that trust had become their weapon. They had buried every concern under false status updates, keeping him in the dark while the bakery's reputation quietly unraveled. His fingers moved faster now, screenshots saved into a separate folder for evidence. This was no longer just a suspicion. It was a pattern, a system, and it had been deliberately engineered. To verify the deception with his own eyes, Andrew once again donned his disguise and returned to Morning Bloom during peak mid-morning hours. The place was busy, a steady stream of customers flowing in and out, many with confused or disappointed expressions as they left. He sat in the corner booth, laptop open in front of him, camera lens embedded discreetly into the frame. Across the room, Brian was at the register, while Eric hovered near the pastry display, adjusting trays and chatting casually with customers. Andrew watched as a young woman ordered 2 almond croissants and a large latte. Brian rang her up for $13.50, an amount that raised Andrew's eyebrows. The original pricing should have been closer to $9. When the customer questioned the cost, Brian smiled dismissively. New pricing tier, weekend surcharge. She hesitated, then paid with a card, clearly uneasy but unwilling to push further. Minutes later, an older man entered and asked for a cinnamon roll, a recipe Andrew himself had perfected with his grandmother. Eric shook his head and said it had been discontinued due to lack of demand. But Andrew had seen the same rolls in the kitchen that very morning, trays stacked and ready for the oven. These weren't mistakes. They were tactics. Psychological nudges meant to shift customers toward newer, cheaper-to-make products, while premium items were hidden away or falsely declared unavailable. And still, people paid, confused but trusting, not realizing that Morning Bloom had quietly become a shell of itself. Andrew recorded it all. Every transaction, every shrug, every misdirection, captured by his lens and backed by store receipts he collected afterward. As the afternoon lull settled over the bakery, Andrew took the opportunity to move closer to the hallway leading toward the office and kitchen. He carried a half-finished muffin and pretended to be searching for the restroom. Just as he neared the hallway's bend, he caught their voices, Brian and Eric, muffled but distinct. "We need to prep the narrative," Brian said. "If Carter asks about missing chocolate again, blame the baking staff. Say it was overused in test batches or accidentally spoiled." Eric chuckled. "Yeah, and if he presses, we throw Emily under the bus. Say she's been hoarding ingredients or ignoring waste protocols. No way to disprove it without security footage, and he hasn't checked that system in months." Andrew stood frozen, heart pounding, every word confirming what he had feared. They weren't just stealing from the business. They were weaponizing lies against loyal employees. His jaw tightened as the voices trailed off into laughter, echoing softly down the tiled hallway. He stepped back quietly, returning to the front of the store before anyone could notice. Outside, the air was crisp, the sun beginning to dip behind the downtown skyline, but Andrew didn't feel the cold. He was too consumed by what he had just heard. The thought of Emily, quiet, hard-working, dedicated Emily, being framed for something she had no part in made his blood boil. He pulled out his phone and listened to the recorded clip again, the confirmation as clear as day. It wasn't just fraud anymore. It was calculated character assassination, aimed at the very heart of the bakery's moral foundation. And it would not stand. That evening, back home, Andrew labeled a new folder on his desktop. Phase 2, Direct Evidence. He uploaded every video, every audio clip, every screenshot. The pieces were falling into place, but he knew he still needed more. A confession, unscripted, undeniable. Something that even the best defense lawyer couldn't discredit. But he was close now. The damage Brian and Eric had inflicted was deep, but it wasn't irreversible. Not yet. And with every file he archived, with every pattern he confirmed, Andrew grew more certain. The reckoning was coming. And when it did, it wouldn't just be about reclaiming a business. It would be about restoring every ounce of dignity that had been stolen from his staff, his customers, and his family legacy. The quiet hum of the espresso machine was the only sound in the law office of Natalie Brooks as she listened intently to Andrew Carter's story. She sat behind her oak desk, framed by a wall of legal books and degrees, her expression focused, professional, but not without a flicker of disbelief. As Andrew detailed the inventory discrepancies, the doctored financial records, the staff intimidation, and finally, the captured audio of Brian and Eric conspiring to shift blame onto innocent employees, her brow furrowed. When he handed her a printed report of customer complaints marked "resolved" without action, she took a long breath and leaned back in her chair. "Andrew," she said, folding her hands, "this isn't just mismanagement. This is coordinated corporate sabotage. And if you can prove intent, you have grounds for immediate termination, civil litigation, and, depending on what we find next, potential criminal charges." Andrew exhaled slowly. Hearing those words from a lawyer made everything real in a new, heavy way. For weeks he had suspected, observed, and documented, but this was the first time someone had framed it in terms of justice. "But suspicion and spreadsheets won't be enough," Natalie continued. "We need direct evidence. A confession would be ideal, and the more unfiltered, the better. Something captured naturally, in their own words, without pressure or prompting." Andrew nodded. "They've already started talking in private, confident that I'm clueless. I've been recording bits here and there with a hidden mic." Natalie tapped her pen against her notebook. "Then we scale it. We set a trap. We get them to believe their plan is working, and let them boast about it in front of someone they think is on their side. It was risky, but Andrew knew it was the only way to end this the right way. That night, he contacted Owen Parker, a former client from his legal career turned security specialist. They met in Andrew's garage, away from the bakery's surveillance network. Owen brought with him a small briefcase, inside of which were compact, high-resolution cameras and microphones disguised as ordinary fixtures, an air freshener, a wall clock, even a coat hook. These are motion-activated, encrypted, and transmit live to a secure cloud, Owen explained, walking Andrew through setup instructions. "Place them in the manager's office, near the register, and one in the main seating area. No one will notice, but you'll hear and see everything." By the following morning, the equipment was in place. It felt like Morning Bloom had transformed into a stage, and the final act was about to begin. Next came the bait. Andrew needed someone to pose as a serious investor, a figure who could give Brian and Eric the illusion of opportunity while extracting their secrets in the process. He called on Michael Grant, a longtime business associate and friend from his earlier days in corporate law. Michael had the look, the confidence, and more importantly, the experience to carry out the role flawlessly. "I need you to act like you're ready to buy the bakery," Andrew explained over coffee. "Make them think they're weeks away from sealing the deal. Get them comfortable. Let them brag." Michael gave a slow nod. "Let me guess. You want arrogance to lead to confession?" Andrew smiled faintly. "Exactly." Michael agreed on the spot, and they rehearsed the cover story. He was a partner at a fictitious firm called Apex Ventures, looking to expand into boutique food brands with community charm. It was exactly the kind of pitch that would appeal to ego-driven schemers. With the trap laid and the players cast, Andrew spent the weekend preparing every detail. Natalie drafted formal letters documenting the paper trail of fraud in case things escalated. Owen calibrated the hidden cameras to auto-sync with timestamps from Morning Bloom's sales system. Michael practiced his persona, and Andrew prepared to blend into the background one last time, disguised, observing, recording. Monday morning arrived, and from his laptop, Andrew watched the feed as Michael walked into the bakery and introduced himself to Eric. The moment was electric. Eric's posture shifted from indifferent to eager in an instant. "I'm here to speak with Brian or Eric Russo," Michael said smoothly, "about a possible acquisition." Just as they had hoped, Eric's eyes lit up. "You came to the right place," he said with a grin. "Let me take you to the back." The two disappeared into the manager's office, unaware that every word they spoke was about to be captured in stunning clarity. From his office down the street, Andrew listened as the audio began to roll in. Brian joined them moments later, and what followed was exactly what Natalie had predicted. The two managers walked Michael through their entire scheme with no hesitation. They talked about how they had streamlined ingredient sourcing, code for downgrading quality. They explained how adjusting the customer experience was their way of increasing profits while discouraging long-term loyalty. And most importantly, they detailed how they'd been inflating losses to convince Andrew to sell, planning to acquire the bakery through a shell company, Midline Partners, LLC. "We've already got the owner right where we want him," Brian said, laughing. "He's sentimental. He won't fight it. He'll think he's saving the business by handing it over." Michael pressed further, asking if Andrew suspected anything. Eric waved it off. "He's clueless. By the time he figures it out, it'll be too late." Andrew's hands shook slightly as he heard those words, not with anger, but with resolve. The game had just changed, and now he held the checkmate in his hand. It was a cold Thursday morning when Andrew Carter made the call that would finally break the silence within the bakery's walls. The trap had been set. The confessions from Brian and Eric were now safely recorded, but there was one missing piece: the human side of the story, the staff who had quietly suffered in the shadows. Andrew chose a quiet cafe 3 blocks from Morning Bloom, neutral ground far enough from curious eyes. He asked Emily, the longtime head baker, to meet him there, and she arrived 15 minutes early, bundled in a thick coat, a knitted scarf tucked close to her chin. Her usual confident demeanor was gone. She looked worn, her eyes scanning the cafe nervously before she spotted Andrew sitting at a corner table with a steaming cup of tea waiting for her. "Thank you for coming," he said gently, rising to pull out a chair for her. She sat slowly, removing her scarf and folding her hands tightly on the table. "I've been wanting to talk to you for months," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I couldn't." For a long moment, Emily just stared at the table. Then, with a deep breath, the words began to pour out. She explained how things had changed almost immediately after Brian and Eric took over as senior managers. They had started with minor adjustments, new vendor orders, different packaging for ingredients, but soon those changes became more drastic. "They told me to stop using the original vanilla bean paste," she said it was too expensive and that no one could tell the difference. When I pushed back, Brian told me it wasn't a request. She looked up, pain in her eyes. He said if I didn't get with the new program, he'd find someone younger, faster, and less emotionally attached to the way things used to be. Andrew's stomach sank. "Did you ever think to call me?" he asked softly. Emily hesitated, then shook her head. "I tried. Twice. But they were monitoring calls, our shifts, even who we talked to during breaks. Eric intercepted one of my emails to the office, then cut my hours the following week." As they spoke, Jake entered the cafe, the young cashier Andrew remembered from his first undercover visit. Just 23, Jake had once been full of promise and energy, often working double shifts and taking night classes. But today, he looked pale and tense, his backpack slung heavily over one shoulder. He slid into the seat next to Emily and gave Andrew a quick, uneasy smile. "Thanks for calling," Jake said. "I'm glad someone's finally doing something." Andrew leaned in, speaking calmly. "I need to know everything. What's been going on behind the scenes?" Jake didn't hesitate. "They've been stealing tips," he said bluntly. "They take the jar at the end of the day, count it behind closed doors, and give us maybe a third of what's actually there. If that." Andrew's fists clenched beneath the table. "And that's not even the worst of it," Jake continued. "They've been telling customers that you don't care anymore, that you approved all the changes." The revelation stung like a slap. Andrew had spent years cultivating a reputation as a hands-on, caring owner, someone who greeted regulars by name and celebrated milestones with his staff. To hear that Brian and Eric had painted him as an absentee profiteer cut deeply. "They've even told new hires that you're just a figurehead now," Jake said, That everything good about the bakery was their doing, and everything bad was your fault. Emily nodded in agreement. They weaponized your silence, Andrew. We tried to speak up, but they made it feel dangerous. She recounted how two longtime staff members, Karen and Louise, had been fired after raising concerns about ingredient swaps and overcharging customers. They called it insubordination, Emily said bitterly, but we all knew it was because they asked too many questions. Andrew sat back, the weight of their words settling on his shoulders like stone. He had known things were wrong, but hearing it from Emily and Jake made it personal in a way numbers and spreadsheets never could. These weren't just employees. They were people who had poured years of loyalty, energy, and care into Morning Bloom, and they had been silenced, manipulated, and betrayed. "I'm sorry," Andrew said, his voice quiet but firm. "You should never have been put in that position, and you will never be in it again." Emily reached across the table and touched his hand, her fingers cold but steady. "We just want the bakery back," she said. "The real one, the one your grandmother built, the one that meant something." Jake nodded. "We're with you. Whatever you need." By the time the meeting ended, Andrew had everything he needed. Not just facts, but heart. Not just data, but truth spoken aloud. He walked back to his office with a renewed sense of purpose, his notebook now filled with direct testimony. Emily and Jake had given him more than information. They had reignited his conviction. The recordings would make the case. The confession would seal it. But the courage of two loyal staff members would remind him what he was fighting for. Morning Bloom wasn't just a business, it was a promise, and Andrew was ready to keep it. Later that evening, long after the city had dimmed into soft pools of street lamplight and the bakery had closed its doors for the day, Andrew Carter sat in silence in his study. The voices of Emily and Jake echoed in his mind, not the literal recordings, though those were safely stored, but the emotions behind them. Fear, fatigue, a quiet hope, and perhaps most haunting of all, the lingering damage done to the very thing he had worked so hard to protect. He reached for his notebook and turned to a clean page, then wrote a single sentence. "They don't believe I care anymore." The words struck him with more force than he expected. Somewhere between expansion plans and quarterly projections, he had become distant, not just physically, but emotionally. And Brian and Eric had used that distance as a shield to protect their scheme, telling staff he was too busy, too uninterested, or too far removed to intervene. It wasn't just that the employees had stopped reaching out, it was that they had been told not to, told by managers who deliberately intercepted messages, who rerouted concerns, who created a new workplace culture where loyalty was punished and silence was rewarded. Andrew leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. What hurt wasn't that they believed the lies. It was that he had unknowingly allowed those lies to spread unchecked. Jake's words haunted him. They said everything bad was your fault. And if he didn't act soon, maybe it would be. With resolve tightening in his chest, he flipped to a new page and began sketching a timeline. Not of fraud, but of betrayal. Emily had mentioned key staff being fired after raising concerns. Jake had talked about new hires being conditioned to fear Andrew's involvement. It was no longer a question of mismanagement. It was a full-blown coup masked beneath the structure of normal business operations. Over the next 48 hours, Andrew intensified his efforts to piece together the truth. Through digital security logs, he confirmed that Brian and Eric had hosted a series of private meetings inside the bakery after hours. They were always careful. No emails, no messages, but the building's access system told the real story. Visits from unfamiliar individuals tagged as vendors or contractors, many of whom had never appeared on any project or service invoice. He cross-referenced the times with recent security camera footage and spotted exactly what Emily had warned him about: investors being given tours. He saw Brian walking men in suits past the baking stations, gesturing toward the floor plan with pride, while Eric pulled out what appeared to be mock-ups of rebranded signage and product displays. This wasn't a potential plan. They were actively selling Morning Bloom before they even owned it. What shocked Andrew most was the confidence with which Brian and Eric operated. In one clip, they even poured glasses of wine for two guests in the manager's office, casually referencing transition dates and post-acquisition upgrades. The arrogance was staggering. They weren't trying to hide anymore. They believed they were invincible. With the shell company midline partners quietly registered and the books reflecting false losses, they had constructed an airtight illusion of a business ready to collapse, one that only they could save. And Andrew, trusting and absent, was the perfect pawn in their game. Watching the footage, Andrew realized that the sabotage wasn't just about embezzlement or price manipulation. It was about control. Control of people, of perception, of legacy. The sabotage ran deeper than he'd imagined. It was systematic and strategic. They hadn't just targeted the business infrastructure. They had dismantled the culture. Andrew reviewed messages intercepted by Brian, including an internal memo meant for him regarding a staff fundraising idea that never reached his inbox. He found a suggestion box in the staff break room where notes were regularly removed before anyone could see them. In the employee scheduling system, he saw how hours had been subtly cut from the most loyal staff, those who had served Morning Bloom for years, while newer, more impressionable hires were given more shifts and praised publicly. It was clear now, Brian and Eric had created two classes of workers, one to silence, one to manipulate. They were laying the groundwork for a clean sweep once the sale was complete. The worst part came late Sunday night as Andrew reviewed footage from 3 days prior. In it, Eric leaned against the counter, talking with a customer who complimented the bakery's long history. "Yeah," Eric said casually, "but the guy who started it sold out years ago. Just some investor now. We're the ones running the show." The customer laughed, but Andrew didn't. It was more than misinformation. It was identity theft. They had stolen his name, his principles, his connection to the community, and reshaped them into a false narrative to serve their own agenda. Morning Bloom wasn't just under attack, it was being rewritten in real time, and unless he acted quickly, the version that survived wouldn't include him or the truth. But now, the truth was clearer than ever. Andrew wasn't just going to fight to reclaim his bakery. He was going to expose every lie, every manipulation, every falsified report and broken promise. With Natalie's legal files growing thicker and the surveillance evidence piling up by the hour, all he needed now was timing. Brian and Eric had told the world they were the future of Morning Bloom. Andrew was going to show them, publicly and without mercy, that they were only ever a footnote in a much larger story. A story about integrity, about legacy, and about the quiet power of an owner who still cared more than they ever imagined. The morning air was sharp and still as Michael Grant stepped out of a black sedan and approached the front doors of Morning Bloom Bakery. Dressed in a tailored navy suit, leather briefcase in one hand, and designer sunglasses perched on his collar, he looked every inch the successful venture capitalist he was pretending to be. His polished shoes clicked against the pavement with practiced confidence, but beneath the professional facade was the quiet coordination of something far more tactical. Michael wasn't just here to buy pastries, he was here to bait a trap. A longtime friend and former colleague of Andrew Carter, he had agreed to step into the role of a high-profile investor from a fabricated firm called Atlas Ventures. The firm's branding, digital footprint, and fake website had all been crafted in secret, just convincing enough to fool two men drunk on their own deception. Inside, Eric Russo stood behind the counter, flipping through a clipboard when he noticed Michael entering. His demeanor shifted instantly, from indifferent clerk to eager salesman. "Good morning," he said with a broad smile, wiping his hands on his apron. "How can I help you today?" Michael smiled, flashing a polished business card that read, "Michael Grant, Atlas Ventures, Strategic Acquisitions. I'm here to speak with Mr. Russo or Mr. Matthews regarding a potential acquisition." Eric's eyes lit up. "Ah, that's me, Eric Russo. Let me take you to the back." He leaned toward the kitchen door and called out, "Brian, we've got company." Within seconds, Brian Matthews emerged, just as rehearsed, adjusting his collar and flashing a grin. "Mr. Grant, welcome," he said, extending a hand. "Glad you could make it. Let's talk in the office." Unbeknownst to either of them, every word, gesture, and raised eyebrow was being captured by the small, motion-activated cameras installed days earlier by Andrew's security expert. The red light never blinked, but it was watching, and it was listening. Once inside the office, Michael took a seat opposite the two men. The room smelled faintly of burnt coffee and paper, the desk cluttered with spreadsheets and marketing mock-ups for a brand that didn't yet exist, Metro Bites. As Brian began the pitch, Michael played his part flawlessly, nodding thoughtfully, asking insightful but non-threatening questions, and jotting notes on a legal pad. It didn't take long before the mask slipped. "We've been managing this place for about a year now," Brian began confidently. "The owner, Carter, he's basically hands-off. Doesn't even know what's really going on here." Eric chuckled. "We've streamlined the operations, cut costs, changed suppliers, replaced all that sentimental junk he was obsessed with. Quality's lower, but margins are higher. Customers barely notice. And the ones who do? We replace them with tourists. Quick turnover, higher spend." Michael leaned in slightly. "And your plan is to acquire it outright?" Brian nodded. "Yeah. We've set up a holding company, midline partners, shell structure, off the radar. Once Carter sees the Q4 numbers, he'll be desperate. We swoop in with a rescue package, offer to buy the bakery at a fraction of its value. He'll think we're doing him a favor," Eric added with a smirk. "And then we flip it. New brand, new vibe, minimal overhead. This whole nostalgic bakery thing is a dinosaur. We turn it into Metro Bites, bring in modern designs, digital kiosks, subscription pastry boxes, you name it." Michael scribbled notes, feigning interest. "And Carter?" he asked. "You think he'll agree to the deal?" Brian laughed. "The guy still thinks baking is about community. He has no idea we've been sinking this place from the inside out." As the conversation deepened, the confessions became more brazen. They talked about inflated pricing, how they'd intentionally downgraded ingredients, and even how they'd misled loyal employees into believing Andrew had approved every decision. "We've created distance," Eric explained. "We made Carter look like the bad guy so nobody asks questions. The staff barely looks him in the eye anymore." The pride in their voices was sickening, and Michael knew the cameras were capturing every word in crystal clarity. He kept them talking for another 20 minutes, allowing the two men to outline their complete roadmap for deception, acquisition, and rebranding. Everything Andrew had feared, and more, was being confirmed in real time. Not just sabotage, but deliberate dismantling of a legacy, all in pursuit of profit. As the meeting wrapped, Michael stood and shook both their hands. "This is promising," he said smoothly. "I'll speak to my partners. We may move quickly on this." Brian and Eric nodded enthusiastically, walking him to the door with a confidence that would soon be their undoing. As Michael stepped outside into the late morning sun, he exhaled deeply, pulling out his phone and dialing Andrew. "It's done," he said simply. "They took the bait, all of it." Inside, the hidden cameras continued to roll, capturing Brian and Eric toasting with leftover espresso in paper cups. "By next month, this place is ours," Eric declared. "Carter won't even see it coming." They laughed, oblivious to the fact that he already had. Back at his office, Andrew watched the footage as it streamed in. He didn't speak. He didn't blink. Every lie, every boast, every manipulation was now evidence, clear, irrefutable, and devastating. He watched them mock his name, rewrite his story, and plan their victory on his back. But the truth was no longer hidden, and the reckoning they never saw coming was already in motion. For the first time in weeks, Andrew allowed himself a small smile. The betrayal had been deep, but now justice would be deeper. The sky was still a soft grey when Andrew Carter pulled into the back lot of Morning Bloom Bakery. It was the earliest he had arrived in months, this time not in disguise, not hidden in the shadows, but as himself, a man with purpose, a man with proof. He wore a charcoal suit, a subtle nod to the formality of what was about to unfold, and in his hand he carried his grandmother's cream-colored baker's coat, still embroidered with morning bloom in blue script. He hadn't worn it in years. Today, it felt right. By 7:30 a.m., his lawyer, Natalie Brooks, arrived with a sleek leather portfolio under her arm. She greeted him with a firm nod. "All documents are ready. The footage is edited. Legal grounds are solid. You're ready." Andrew nodded, his jaw tight with resolve. "Let's take our bakery back." Inside, Leo, the young cashier, was already setting up the counter when Andrew walked in. "Lock the front doors," Andrew instructed gently. "Put up a sign that says, 'Closed for a special event. Please return at 8:30. Leo obeyed without hesitation, though his eyes searched Andrew's face for clues. "What's going on?" he asked. Andrew gave a small smile. "Something that should have happened a long time ago." Over the next 30 minutes, staff arrived one by one. Emily, Jake, the kitchen crew, part-time baristas, all of them summoned for what they had only been told was an important staff announcement. They gathered quietly in the main seating area, where chairs had been arranged in rows facing a projector screen now hanging from the front wall. Whispers filled the air, confusion thick. And then, at 8:05 a.m., the door opened again, this time not for employees, but for familiar faces from the neighborhood. Mrs. Peterson, Mr. Alvarez, the retired teachers' coffee club, even the mayor's assistant. Each had received a personal call from Andrew the night before. Each had been part of Morning Bloom's soul. At 8:15 sharp, the final bell above the door jingled one last time as Brian Matthews and Eric Russo walked in, both stopping short when they saw the unusual setup. "What the hell is this?" Brian muttered under his breath. Eric looked around nervously. "Why are there customers here for a staff meeting?" he asked, masking his concern with a weak grin. Andrew stepped forward from behind the counter, now wearing the baker's coat his grandmother once wore with pride. The room quieted. "Thank you all for coming," he said, his voice calm but firm. "This bakery was built on trust, between staff, between customers, and between generations. But that trust has been broken. Today, we begin to repair it." Natalie dimmed the lights. The projector came to life, and the first recording began to play. The footage was undeniable. Brian and Eric's voices filled the room as they bragged about downgrading ingredients, lying to customers, manipulating financial records, and planning to buy the bakery through a shell company. Their words were casual, confident, even celebratory. They laughed about making Carter look like the bad guy and mocked loyal customers as sentimental holdouts. Gasps echoed across the room as longtime patrons realized the depth of the deception. Mrs. Peterson clutched her handbag. Emily covered her mouth. Jake shook his head in disbelief. But Andrew stood tall, unmoving, his eyes never leaving the screen. For 15 minutes, the bakery became a courtroom, and the evidence spoke louder than any accusation could. When the lights came back on, the silence was deafening. Brian stood frozen, his face pale. You recorded us," he sputtered. "This is illegal. This is entrapment." Eric took a step back, his mouth opening and closing, like he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. Natalie stepped forward, her voice ice cold. "Actually, the recordings were made on private property, under surveillance authorized by the business owner. All parties involved were speaking voluntarily, and everything captured is admissible in court." She opened her portfolio and placed 2 thick folders on the counter. "We also have financial records, sworn affidavits, and digital correspondence that corroborate every word you said." Andrew turned to them. "Brian Matthews, Eric Russo, your employment at Morning Bloom Bakery is terminated, effective immediately." For a split second, Brian looked as if he might argue. But then 2 security guards, hired in advance by Natalie, stepped forward from the hallway and flanked the men. The staff and customers watched in stunned silence as Brian and Eric were escorted out, their shoulders slumped, their expressions hollow. The final blow wasn't a shout or a slap. It was the quiet dignity with which the community watched them leave. The same people they had manipulated, dismissed, and underestimated now stood in silent judgment. Justice didn't need noise. It needed truth, and Andrew had delivered it. Once the doors closed behind them, the room slowly exhaled. Then, as if on cue, applause erupted. Not the loud, triumphant kind, but a soft, grateful ripple of sound. Andrew raised his hand to settle the room. "I owe each of you an apology," he said, "for trusting the wrong people, for being distant, for letting you believe I didn't care. That ends now." He looked at Emily. "All original recipes are being reinstated starting today. Prices will return to where they were 6 months ago. And tips, every dollar, will be distributed fairly, effective immediately." He turned to Leo and smiled. "And our team will be part of every decision from now on. Because this bakery doesn't belong to me, it belongs to all of us." The bakery had seen betrayal, but it was now witnessing something stronger: redemption. By the following morning, the warmth inside Morning Bloom Bakery was no longer just from the ovens. It radiated from the people. Their voices lighter, their movements more energized, the space filled once again with the quiet hum of purpose. As the early sun filtered through the windows, Andrew Carter stood behind the counter, sleeves rolled up, apron on, and a list of reinstated recipes tucked under his arm. The first to arrive that day was Emily. She paused briefly in the doorway, her eyes scanning the space as if seeing it for the first time in years. "You're here early," she said with a hint of a smile. Andrew looked up from a tray of rising dough and replied, "So are you." Then he held out a folder. "Your title's been updated. General Manager. Effective immediately." Emily's eyes widened in disbelief. "What?" "You've been holding this place together long before I realized it was falling apart," Andrew said softly. "You deserve more than a thank you." The staff meeting that morning was unlike any before. Chairs were rearranged around the main dining space, trays of fresh muffins were passed out, and the atmosphere was no longer tense. It was alive. Andrew stood at the front, holding the same clipboard Brian once used to intimidate. But today, it served a different purpose. "We're going back," he announced. "Back to the recipes that made Morning Bloom what it was meant to be. The cinnamon rolls, the real Belgian chocolate, the blueberry muffins with actual blueberries and not flavoring. We're bringing it all back." Applause broke out, spontaneous and heartfelt. "Prices are dropping too. We're honoring our community, not exploiting them. And tips, every cent, tracked and distributed daily, with a 15% match from the business for good measure." The staff exchanged looks of disbelief. Some even clapped with tears in their eyes. But Andrew wasn't finished. "Jake," he said, turning toward the young cashier, "you're promoted to assistant manager, and your tuition for business school. Consider it covered." Jake blinked, stunned. For a long moment, he didn't say anything, just stared at Andrew with wide eyes and a trembling chin. Then, with a shaky voice, he managed, "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll keep showing up," Andrew replied, smiling. "Because this place needs people who care, and you've proven that again and again." Emily walked over and placed a hand on Jake's shoulder. "Looks like we're rebuilding this thing together," she said. He nodded, overcome, then quickly wiped his eyes with the sleeve of his shirt. Around them, employees cheered, clapped, and exchanged hugs. The energy in the room was electric, a sharp contrast to the hushed anxiety that had dominated just days before. The air smelled like cinnamon and redemption. As word spread, loyal customers returned one by one. Mrs. Peterson came in the following day and was greeted with a fresh blueberry muffin on the house. The retired teachers' coffee club reclaimed their corner table, this time with loyalty cards renewed and prices rolled back to what they remembered. New signage went up, not with corporate slogans or digital buzzwords, but hand-painted boards with phrases like "baked with heart" and "from our oven to your home." Emily oversaw kitchen operations with grace and clarity, while Jake trained the newer staff with the confidence of someone who had found his place. The entire building seemed to breathe again. The floors were swept with care. The espresso machine gleamed like it had been scrubbed of the past, and the laughter that had once disappeared echoed once more off the tile walls. 3 weeks after the public reveal, Andrew stood at the register during the Saturday morning rush. A line of customers stretched out the door, a sight he hadn't seen in nearly a year. He helped box pastries, handed out coffee, and checked in with nearly everyone by name. One customer, a woman holding her daughter's hand, leaned over the counter and said, "It feels like morning bloom again." Andrew nodded. "That's the goal." Behind him, Emily shouted an order to the kitchen staff, while Jake rang up a group of students at the counter. The entire team moved like a single, well-tuned machine. It wasn't perfect. There were still long days, occasional mistakes, and growing pains, but the spirit was back. The foundation was real, and more importantly, it was theirs. That night, after the final tray was washed and the chairs stacked, Andrew gathered the staff for one final message. "What we did this past month wasn't just about firing 2 bad actors," he said. "It was about rediscovering who we are. We can't rewrite the past, but we can rebuild the future, and it starts here, with all of you." He looked at Emily, then Jake, then the rest of his team. "This isn't just a comeback, it's a promise to do better, to listen more, to lead with heart." The team raised their paper cups of tea and coffee. Emily spoke first. "To morning bloom." And with that, the bakery that had once been on the edge of collapse was fully, gloriously alive again, reborn not just through recipes or prices, but through the people who believed in it all along. It started slowly, just a few familiar faces returning on a crisp Monday morning, the line stretching slightly past the doorway, the smell of fresh cinnamon rolls wafting down the sidewalk. Then, by the end of the week, it was undeniable. Morning bloom was back. The once quiet storefront now buzzed with energy every morning as the doors opened. Loyal customers brought friends. Parents brought their kids. Tourists who had read about the bakery's revival in a local food blog added it to their must-visit list. And there, at the center of it all, stood Andrew Carter, no longer hiding behind spreadsheets or disguises, but in the heart of the bakery, wearing his apron, sleeves rolled up, shaking hands and asking, "How's the coffee today?" Morning Bloom didn't just recover, it became something new, something stronger. Not a business, but a movement fueled by trust, community, and second chances. Emily now moved through the kitchen like a conductor in front of a symphony. Gone was the woman once overshadowed by stress and silence. In her place stood a leader, steady, composed, and respected by all. She revived old recipes and added new ones inspired by customer suggestions. She organized weekly staff brainstorms and even launched a monthly Community Favorites feature where patrons could vote on new menu items. Her authority was quiet but unquestionable. Every decision she made reinforced the values that Morning Bloom stood for: honesty, warmth, and connection. Jake, now assistant manager, had become a pillar in the front of house. With a clean apron and a constant smile, he trained each new hire not just on how to run a register, but how to remember someone's favorite muffin, how to listen, and how to care. In the evenings, he still attended his business classes, and when customers asked where he learned to lead like that, he'd smile and say, "Right here." The transformation inside Morning Bloom was mirrored by the view across the street, where the rival bakery, Metro Bites, stood. What had opened with fanfare and glossy branding had quickly turned into a ghost town. The community didn't forget the betrayal. Flyers boasting modern flavors and fast casual reimagined had little impact in a neighborhood that valued kindness over convenience. Within weeks of opening, Metro Bites faced boycotts and public scrutiny. Former Morning Bloom customers, now aware of Brian and Eric's deception, refused to cross its threshold. Food critics who once gave them cautious optimism pulled their reviews. On one occasion, a group of students staged a silent protest outside its door, holding signs that read, "We bloom together and integrity matters." Emily watched from the kitchen one afternoon as Brian stood outside Metro Bites, arms crossed, face drawn, staring at the line across the street that had once been his. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply turned back to the stove, flipping a fresh batch of pancakes for the morning special. Meanwhile, Morning Bloom's story spread. Local journalists ran features on the bakery's turnaround, praising it as a blueprint for ethical leadership and community resilience. Business podcasts interviewed Andrew about leading with humility and rebuilding from within. A university professor even requested permission to use the Morning Bloom case in her business ethics curriculum, but through it all, the team stayed grounded. Andrew turned down a chain expansion offer from a venture capital group, choosing instead to reinvest in staff development, facility improvements, and neighborhood programs. "We're not here to scale," he told them. "We're here to serve. That's the real growth." Every week, more stories poured in. Parents sharing how Morning Bloom became their post-soccer Saturday stop again, or a couple who said their first date had been here, and now they were returning with their toddler. Inside the bakery, small but powerful changes took root. Staff members felt empowered to contribute ideas and lead initiatives. One barista started a kindness jar at the register, where customers could leave notes of encouragement instead of tips if they couldn't afford it. A high school intern was given a chance to pitch a gluten-free line of cookies, and when they sold out in 2 days, she was offered a part-time position after graduation. Morning Bloom became more than just a place to get coffee and pastries. It became a place where people felt seen. And perhaps most importantly, it became a workplace where people felt valued. For Emily and Jake, each new day brought not just tasks, but meaning. For Andrew, the success wasn't in the rising revenue, but in the laughter during morning prep, in the sound of regulars calling out staff names, and in the quiet, knowing glances exchanged across the kitchen. 3 months after the fall of Brian and Eric, Andrew stood outside the front doors of Morning Bloom before sunrise, sipping his coffee as the sky began to warm. The sign above him glowed gently in the early light. Morning Bloom Bakery, established with heart. Behind the glass, the prep team was already hard at work, and he could hear Emily's voice calling out instructions. Jake was checking off inventory with a clipboard, teasing a new hire about labeling the flour bins correctly. A delivery truck pulled up out front, bringing fresh milk and eggs. And from down the block, a familiar line was beginning to form. Parents holding little hands, college students balancing laptops, elderly neighbors wrapped in scarves. Andrew smiled. The bakery was alive, not in spite of its wounds, but because of them. Morning Bloom had been burned, broken, and nearly lost. But from the ashes of betrayal, it had bloomed again, stronger, deeper, and more rooted than ever before. The lights were low, the chairs were pulled in, and the last customer had stepped out into the fading dusk when Andrew Carter called the team together. It had become a tradition. These quiet, end-of-day gatherings where ideas were shared, laughter spilled freely, and the weight of the day softened into something lighter. But tonight felt different. There was something sacred in the air, something deeper than just celebration or reflection. Andrew stood at the front of the bakery, a yellowed, handwritten sheet of paper held gently in his hands. Its creases were worn, its ink faded with time. "Before we talk numbers or schedules," he began, "I want to read something to you. My grandmother wrote this nearly 40 years ago when she opened Morning Bloom from our kitchen table." The room fell silent as Andrew read her words aloud, a mission not crafted by consultants or branding experts, but by a woman with heart. A bakery is not just a place to buy bread. It is where stories are shared over coffee, where neighbors become family, where tradition meets possibility. Let this be a space where people feel seen, fed, and loved. For a long moment after he finished, no one spoke. Emily wiped a tear from her cheek. Jake sat up straighter, his pen frozen midair. The room had heard many things over the past few months, confessions, apologies, declarations of change, but this was different. This was origin. Andrew placed the fragile page into a protective sleeve and smiled softly. "We've come a long way," he said. "We've faced sabotage, mistrust, and pain. But today, Morning Bloom isn't just restored. It's reborn. And as we move forward, I want us to carry her spirit in everything we do." He turned to the counter, where a tray covered with a linen cloth rested. With a small flourish, he pulled the cloth back to reveal a dozen carefully crafted doughnuts, each decorated uniquely, each paired with a small name card. "We're launching something new next week," he said. "A donut line called Neighborhood Bites. Every flavor is inspired by someone in this community who helped shape us." Gasps and delighted whispers rippled through the room. There was Gonzalez Blueberry Bliss, named after Mrs. Peterson, whose loyalty never wavered. Jake's Mocha Crunch, a nod to the young man who stayed steady when everything was falling apart. Emily's Citrus Honey Glaze, as warm and balanced as the woman it honored. There was even Karen's Caramel Apple, named for the former staff member unjustly let go, now rehired and already working part-time again. Each donut was more than a treat. It was a tribute. Andrew explained that the flavors had been developed through a weeks-long collaboration between kitchen staff and customers. "This is how we move forward," he said, "not just with good products, but with gratitude, with stories, with names." The room erupted into applause, not thunderous, but full of meaning. It wasn't just a launch, it was a love letter to the people who kept the bakery's heart beating. Over the next few weeks, Neighborhood Bites became a sensation. Customers came not only to enjoy the flavors, but to ask about the stories behind them. A new chalkboard went up by the entrance titled "This Week's Inspiration," featuring hand-drawn portraits and short bios of the people behind each donut. Kids brought in suggestions for future names. A local artist offered to paint a mural celebrating the bakery's journey. Morning Bloom had become more than a place to eat. It had become a hub of storytelling, resilience, and renewal. And at the center of it all was Andrew, no longer just the owner, but the guardian of something far greater than a brand. He stood at the register each morning, listening to the laughter of old friends reunited, watching Emily lead her team with quiet confidence, seeing Jake mentor a new hire with patient grace. And every so often he'd glance at the framed mission on the wall, a silent nod to the woman who had started it all. Yet even in the midst of joy, Andrew knew that the lessons of the past must never be forgotten. He kept a small folder labeled Crisis Playbook in his office, a growing collection of insights, mistakes, and protocols meant to ensure that Morning Bloom would never be vulnerable again. "Loyalty," he told his team one evening, "is a gift, not a given. It must be nurtured every single day." He spoke of vigilance, not the paranoid kind, but the thoughtful kind that asks, "Are we still aligned with who we said we'd be?" He empowered every employee to speak up, to ask questions, to challenge decisions if something felt wrong. He redefined leadership not as command, but as listening, really listening. And the impact was undeniable. Staff turnover dropped to zero. Community engagement soared. And perhaps most remarkably, Morning Bloom's financial numbers quietly reached an all-time high without compromising a single core value. As the seasons changed, the bakery adapted too. Fall brought spiced pumpkin pastries. Winter introduced the Warm Wishes box, a rotating sampler of holiday-themed treats, each one inspired by a customer memory submitted on handwritten cards. But no matter the menu, the mission remained the same. Andrew stood one late evening by the front window, watching the last leaves fall as the bakery closed for the night. Emily passed by with her clipboard, Jake waved goodnight from the street, and a new hire, barely 17, turned off the open sign with reverence. Andrew took one last sip of coffee and turned off the lights. Morning Bloom no longer needed to prove it had survived. It had thrived, not because it avoided hardship, but because it had honored its legacy, embraced change, and chosen to lead with humanity. And so the story continued. One pastry, one customer, one act of kindness at a time. If this story moved you, inspired you, or reminded you of the quiet power of doing the right thing, even when no one's watching, then we invite you to become part of our mission. At Deep Inside HQ, we bring you stories that uncover truth, confront injustice, and celebrate redemption. Don't just scroll past. Like this video, share it with someone who needs a reminder that integrity still matters, and subscribe to our channel for more real stories with real impact. Your support helps us keep telling the stories that others overlook, stories that restore faith, spark change, and remind us all of what truly matters.